the recent conflict between Iran and Israel. What is the current status of the conflict, and how has China evolved or impacted? What actions has China taken thus far to support Iran, and what can this tell us about China's strategic calculus? To discuss these questions and more, we are joined by Mona Yacobian and Tuvia Goering. Mona Yacobian is a senior advisor and director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She has more than 30 years of experience working on the Middle East and North Africa with a focus on conflict analysis, governance and stabilization challenges, and conflict prevention. She was previously vice president of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she managed field programming in Iraq, Libya, and Tunisia, as well as Washington, D.C.-based staff. In 2019, she served as executive director of the congressionally appointed Syria Study Group. From 2014 to 2017, she served as deputy assistant administrator in the Middle East Bureau at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where she had responsibility for programming across Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Tuvia Goering is a China analyst at Planet 9, a Tel Aviv and East Asia-based tech company. He is also a visiting researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies Diane Guilford Glazer Foundation Israel-China Policy Center, and a non-resident fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Previously, he was a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and the Israeli-Chinese Media Center. Goering is the editor and author of Discourse Power on Substack, a newsletter covering leading Chinese perspectives on current affairs. He holds a BA in East Asian Studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and an MPH in Disaster and Emergency Management from Tel Aviv University. This podcast was recorded on July 14th, 2025. Mona and Tuvia, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
So this is a very timely topic, and I know things are still changing on the ground, but to the extent possible, Mona, I'd love to start with you to ask for your sense of the background of what led to the current conflict and tensions between Iran and Israel.
Yeah, I think we should understand last month's 12-day war in the context of Hamas's unprecedented terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. It's really from that point that we've seen a very significant escalation of tensions between Israel and Iran. Just one day after October 7th, Hezbollah, one of the most powerful militias in the Iranian allied axis of resistance, initiated strikes on Israel. We then saw the Houthis, another Iranian-backed militia, this one based in Yemen, undertaking strikes, as well as Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. And so this kind of tit-for-tat escalation eventually led to direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran, starting first in April of last year, and then again in October of 2024. And I note this because really, in a lot of ways, I think provides an understanding of the lead up to the confrontation and the war that we've just witnessed. Really, those direct military confrontations between Israel and Iran, at least in my view, analytically, crossed a Rubicon last year, and we began to see this interstate confrontation. There are lots of factors, I think, that drove the timing of Israeli strikes. First, I think there was a window of Iranian vulnerability that was potentially closing. Israel had already really undertaken fairly significant damage, eroding significantly Iran's air defenses. And then there was also, of course, concerns that Iran was continuing to produce highly enriched uranium at 60% and that it could move to enrich further to 90%. So it was both, I think, a sense of a closing window of opportunity of Iranian vulnerability and a deepening sense of urgency that Iran was potentially moving closer toward a nuclear weapon. I would note, though, I think that there are different assessments as to exactly how close Iran was to a nuclear weapon, or if in fact that was even its intention.
And Mona, how would you assess the current situation on the ground? Obviously, there's been discussions of ceasefire, U.S. involvement, but would you characterize it as relatively stable, or things could escalate any moment?
Well, I should note, of course, following the U.S. intervention, an unprecedented intervention by the United States, On June 22nd, the U.S. targeted 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including Ferdo, this deep underground uranium enrichment facility. That then led to a retaliation by Iran. I would argue highly choreographed retaliation on the U.S. El Udeid military base in Qatar. There were no casualties, and that then paved the way at President Trump's behest for Qatar to mediate this ceasefire that remains. It is still holding, if not shaky. And I think there are some real questions about whether or not Iran might seek to restart or rebuild either air defenses, start to replenish its ballistic missiles, or even could it continue with its nuclear program. There, again, big questions about how much damage, how significant. And so we have those tensions. At the same time, there are continuing indications from the U.S. that, in fact, negotiations between the United States and Iran could be restarted. So we're in this, I would say, a difficult period to assess in terms of where things stand, other than to say that for now, the ceasefire is holding, if not shaky.
Thank you. And Tuvia, what are you seeing in Jerusalem?
Just to add a few points from an Israeli perspective, I think there's something important to understand, that there's been a paradigm shift in Israel after October 7th. So this was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, perpetrated by one of its weakest enemies. And it exhibited the more quickly collapse of Israeli intelligence perception, and it kind of moved Israeli approach to security systematically, that we're not just looking at intelligence and early warning and containment, but also we're looking at capabilities and intentions of our enemies. So in addition to what Mona mentioned, I think it's important to realize that there were credible reports from Israeli military intelligence that Iran was speeding its not just nuclear weapons program, but also its missile arsenal, increasing it from several thousand before the war in June to over 8,000, according to this estimate. And it felt for Israel that Iran was buying time, waiting perhaps for the midterm elections or for Trump to leave the scene. And at the same time, it's been increasing its capabilities of arming a nuclear weapon. And it's not just we had this ability to attack Iran. We had this sense that this is now or never. It's this unprecedented weakness is mentioned, but also the return of the nuclear negotiations in early July. And then you have the weakening of this axis of resistance that was mentioned, especially the crown jewel of Hezbollah and collapse of Assad, which is a major point for transferring arms and weapons through the region. And having Trump's, support in the White House meant that this is an opportunity for Israel to have this preemptive strike against this very credible and real threat.
Thank you very much, Tuvia. You touched on something that I want to cover before delving into more of what does this mean for China and how China has been involved. And that's the role of external powers in supporting both Iran as well as Israel. Mona, turning it back to you, how have you seen external powers supporting Iran in any way, shape, or form? And particularly, did you see Iran specifically request any type of external support?
Starting with the first part of your question, Bonnie, and we've been doing work here at CSIS on this, I hesitate to call it alliance or even axis, but this grouping that even has earned an acronym in Washington of CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And so I think we could look at each of those elements and see to varying extents how in the past they have provided military support or cooperation to Iran. So for example, we know North Korea has provided ballistic missile technology to Iran. Reportedly, the Shahab missile series was heavily influenced by North Korean designs. We know that North Korea also reportedly has provided Iran with tunnel digging technology. That's super important when we look at Ferdo, that, as I noted before, that underground facility that could only be penetrated by bombs that only the United States has in its possession, these 30,000-ton bunker buster bombs. We've also, of course, seen, I think in a more significant way, deepening military cooperation between Iran and Russia, with Russia supplying Iran with its air defense systems, technology, and weapons. But what's interesting is, frankly, in recent time, the flow has really more been going the other way, which is to say from Iran to Russia, providing Russia in particular with drones and ballistic missiles. And then China, of course, comes in, with more limited levels of support. We've seen most recently reports of, for example, chemical components for Iran's missile programs. Now, did Iran ask for help during this conflict? Yes, we believe so. There was a visit, for example, of the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi to Moscow. And that was, I don't remember exactly the date, but sometime into the conflict. And there, it's reported that he asked for help in rebuilding Iran's air defense systems. We should note that Israel really has air superiority over a good swath of Iran, certainly over Western Iran. We can surmise that Iran is probably also looking for replenishment of its ballistic missiles and drones. But again, with Russia in particular, Russia is very much taken with the conflict in Ukraine. And so while there have been requests probably for assistance, we have not seen much. We've seen nothing that we can report other than rhetorical support from Russia and China in particular.
Thank you, Mona. And Tuvia, from Israel's perspective, obviously we've talked about the U.S. support for Israel. Any other significant sources of support? And is Israel also concerned of other sources of support for Iran?
Sure. So beyond the U.S., which was central in supporting Israel, both in defense and then in offense, intelligence sharing, I think Germany, the UK, and France, because they're parties to the JCPOA, and have the ability to reactivate the snapback, which is currently in the news. They were also somewhat important. They did not support Israel directly, except maybe for French, where they said that they did help Israel intercept some drones. But most likely it was limited to intelligence sharing. But still, I think also on the rhetorical level, where you had Germany's Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he declared that Israel was doing the work for all of us, which is a pretty outstanding statement. And I think it makes sense if you see it from their perspective by looking at Iran through history of the revolution, abducting and assassinating their citizen and arming Russia's war now, as Mona said, in Ukraine, exporting regional terror and instability and fundamentalism. And because of this, I think going forward, we also need to look at these parties especially. And beyond the rhetorical level, behind the scenes, sometimes not behind the scenes, but still quite implicit, you see support from Arab states. So they did condemn Israel. But we all understand that the champagne's been running out in supermarkets in the Gulf because they still see Iran as the predominant threat. And they kept their airspace open for Israel. We don't know about help in interception and intelligence because it's not openly reported, but perhaps there is some precedence to it. And that is also something to keep looking at.
Thank you, Tuvia. I now want to transition to look at what China is doing and understand the role that China is currently playing and could play in the future. Maybe Tuvia, over to you. How would you characterize China's approach to the recent Israel-Iran tension conflict? And in particular, how would you describe China's strategic interests vis-a-vis both Iran and Israel?
Well, okay, it's a big question. So I think China, like most of the world, was caught by surprise. The clobbering of its comprehensive strategic partner by Israel, and then with Beijing's strategic rival, the US, is something that surprised, especially when it perceived Iran's weakness. It was forced to quickly navigate this balancing act between its broad regional economic and geopolitical interests, on the one hand, the limitations of its power, along with the risks of entanglement on the other. So this translated to mostly reactive, even realist, insofar pragmatist and self-interested approach to this war. And I think even to a smaller extent, opportunistic approach. We need to take a step back just to consider before this war, there's a lot of rhetoric about this 25-year deal under this comprehensive strategic partnership that China and Iran signed in 2016. And then they signed the 25-year deal in March of 21. This growing trilateral coordination with Russia and Iran, including this week in the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Beijing, and the shared anti-Western, anti-US worldview, culminating in China's mediation of the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia in March 23, engendered a lot of frothing commentaries about this new axis of upheaval, axis of so on and so forth. Facetiously, you can call it an axis of meh, pretty much. And I don't mean to discount the real risk and implications of Iran-China-Russia coordination. I think Mona pointed to them, and there's much more to this behind the scenes. But the breadth and depth of their partnership is far cry from an alliance because of limitations that are inherent to the trust and to China's power in the region and to many other considerations. So diplomatically, what you saw from China over the course of this 12-day war is very limited and forgettable diplomatic four-point proposal made by Xi Jinping. You had condemnations by Wang Yi, the foreign minister, and also by the UN representative, but notably no condemnation from Xi Jinping. His statements were pretty balanced when you consider China's approach to Israel after October 7th. They did, of course, condemn U.S. attack and attacks against nuclear facilities, something they did not do vis-a-vis Russia's attacks on nuclear facilities, only implicitly. On the security front, except for evacuating their citizens, mostly from Iran, a couple of hundreds from Israel, mostly students, they just made some statements about de-escalation, and we couldn't see any direct supply of Chinese weapons to Iran, contrary to some reports. On nuclear support, I think China has this pretty balanced approach of condemning attacks on nuclear facilities and supporting Iran's right for peaceful development of nuclear weapons, but still they are having trouble to address why Iran would enrich uranium over 60%, and also about its ill will with the IAEA, and also about the possibility that Iran would try to reach a bomb. So here I think China's interest more aligned with the other camp, that they are against Iranian nuclear weapons because they appreciate the ramifications it will have on the region and even the world, reaching all the way even to Asia if you get this nuclear cascade of countries arming themselves against the NPT.
Tuvia, a lot to unpack there. Maybe I'll just ask one or two follow-on questions. And of course, Mona, please feel free to jump in. Both you and Mona mentioned the perceived Iranian weakness as well as a window of opportunity. How much did you see that emerge in terms of Chinese scholarly or official discussion of what's happening right now in the Middle East? And to what extent is that really impacting China's considerations on its approach towards Iran?
I think this war sparked intense debates in China about Iran's value and its perceived weakness and ability of continued Chinese support in light of this weakness. And this is what I think was reflected in Beijing's more cautious and even ambivalent response. So one camp that I saw in Chinese debates about this war, they looked at U.S. intervention reinforcing this view that Iran has become a liability. So even before the June war and after October 7th, there were criticisms from scholars that are not big fans of Israel, should I say. But they've been critical also of Tehran's mishandling of the nuclear file, about missing strategic opportunities, about entrenched corruption, autocratic governance, its military weakness. So when Israeli airstrikes began, there was even a palpable wave of schadenfreude in Chinese social media and some academic circles. And this could be seen, for example, in an interview done this week with the Iranian ambassador to China, to Guangzhou, where he was asked about this small wave. Israel appeared to dominate the skies, as Mona explained. Russia and Pakistan, meanwhile, they visibly distanced themselves. So let alone China, what could they do in this situation? So you got the prominent MENA scholars in China talking about this predicament, that it's not just because of US and Israeli and Western pressure, but also because of its own revolutionary ideology, diplomacy, and regional policy, and namely because of its relentless focus on exporting revolution, resisting the US, and seeking to annihilate Israel. And Israel, in contrast, and I can quote, for example, Professor Ma Xiaolin from Zhejiang International Studies University. He talked about Israel normalizing its ties with Arab countries, Muslim countries. During the war, he said that it's no exaggeration, and I quote, to say that Iran brought the Israeli attack on itself. So that's one camp. On the other hand, you got more defense-oriented scholars and policy advisors in China looking at this coming or possible collapse of Iran or a regime change is security threat for China's strategic interests. For example, a former PLA attaché in Iran, in Tehran, Lieutenant Colonel retired Liu Qiang, he called for proactive measures in the event that US and Israeli strangulation, as he called it, succeeded. And he framed Iran's survival as critical to Chinese interests because of its geographic location in the Persian Gulf, its influence across the West Asia, that is the Middle East, its role as this buffer, which he called it, against terrorism, if you believe it, Islamism, meaning ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, and also Turkic nationalism because of the Uyghur, and also NATO expansionism. And that's before taking into account its considerable economic potential in case sanctions are lifted. One other scholar went so far as adding to these arguments that it's not just if Iran falls that NATO troops could amass China's western gates. This was Wang Yiwei. He posted this on Weibo and later deleted it. He also added that China should not intervene militarily, but should support Iran with large quantities of Chinese-made weapons. And this is a sentiment that was echoed a lot by nationalist pundits on Chinese social media, even though we couldn't see any proof of that. And on the normative level, I think, or discourse power level, you saw many Chinese commentators look at this as just another step in US unilateralism, threatening regional stability, and this reinforced Beijing's narrative that the US hegemony is declining and China's version of regional or a new security architecture is better, and it represents the interests of the global south, and so forth.
Tuvia, just to make sure, you said that of the second camp, there are some folks who are saying that China should intervene militarily, or at the minimum provide significant military weapons.
Yes, so this is the extreme end, and I think there were many voices in between. I wouldn't call the latter a consensus. I don't think this represents the majority view. I think that the more cautious approach is what China decided eventually, and it is more in line with its regional policy and its geopolitical, global policies, especially in the Middle East. But it just does not make sense for China to help Iran directly at this point, or at least back then, openly, because it could backfire very easily, first by inciting a much stronger reaction from the US and the international partners, but also among Gulf countries and Israel, which China has been working hard to improve its relations. For this reason, it just not only wouldn't help Iran, but it could also implicate China's interests.
And Mona, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, Tuvia has laid down, I think, a very rich set of points, and maybe just to pull on the thread on a few of them. I mean, first, I love, Tuvia, your phrase of axis of meh, which I think is really correct. And, I think if we're thinking about Iran and China, of all of those different relationships, of that kind of geometry of diplomacy, if you will, in the crink axis, so-called, the Iran-China one is the one that is, frankly, most out of balance. In other words, the Chinese, so far and away, have the upper hand in that relationship. And I think Iran is, from an Iranian perspective, painfully aware of that, and perhaps resigned to the fact that they can't expect much, if anything, from China. I think you hear that, there's a sense sometimes in Tehran amongst the various leaders that, in a sense, they're being exploited by China for their cheap oil. Not that they're going to change anything. I think, Iran is in a very, frankly, desperate place. And so it'll take whatever it can get, but I think not holding their breath on being able to count on much, if anything, from China. I would, in particular, really double down on the point that Tuvia just was closing with, which is, Iran, I think, is supremely aware that China has other equities in the region that it is protecting, and in particular, its ties to Gulf countries. Of course, it depends on, and China is the largest market of export for Iranian oil, but of course, at deep, deep discounts given the sanctions regime. I think the Iranians are savvy enough to know and understand that China really is balancing all of these other equities in the region, including its ties to various Gulf countries and Israel as well. And so as a result, I think Iran is actually resigned to that it's not going to get much, if anything, from China. And that may have a real impact on its willingness, quite frankly, to come back to the negotiating table with the United States, which we are continuing to hear rumors may be the case. And if so, it could well be that Iran has sort of made the calculus that it didn't get really anything from Russia, even though it came to Russia's aid in its hour of need, and not likely to get much, if anything, from China. I will say there was some speculation and some sort of pot shots taken at Russia that I think it's S-300 air defense systems that Iran has didn't perform well, and that this was a real hit to Russia, and that maybe China would come in. But then again, given these equities, I think from the Russian perspective, they're less concerned about the reputational hit of their air defense systems not working well. Russia, too, is interested in deepening and preserving its ties to the Gulf, in particular, and also to Israel. And so I don't think Russia even feels a sense of competition with China should China actually decide to fill in or come in and start to become the provider of those air defense systems. But again, I don't put that scenario as one of high likelihood.
So, Mona, both you and Tuvia have mentioned the importance of how external actors such as China and Russia are balancing relations with Iran, but also with Gulf countries. And I found it fascinating, Tuvia, that you mentioned that the Gulf countries kept their airspace open for Israel. Could you just share a little bit about what position the Gulf countries have taken on this conflict? And to what extent have they made any statements of either Chinese or Russian involvement, or lack thereof?
Yeah, so openly, their involvement in this was pretty minimal. There was a lot of hedging and trying to ensure that they are staying out of this conflict. And for this reason, they were relatively quick to condemn Israel, this way ensuring that in case of an Iranian retaliation against Israel's preemptive strikes, their interests won't be harmed. And I could only make conjectures and speculations because this all happening behind the scenes because of the pretty robust relationship with Israel on the security and intelligence, especially vis-a-vis Iran over the last few years and after the Abraham Accords. There may have been some coordination on the need for Israel not to strike against Iranian oil assets because this could lead to retaliation from Iran on Gulf countries. And all in all, trying to limit their involvement. And I can't recall too many events that are really of interest that relate to China or Russia. There were some phone calls between Wang Yi and foreign ministers of the region. There was this, I think, some coordination with the Organization of Islamic, I always forget to see, the OIC, the Muslim states. But aside from that, I don't think there was a lot going on from the Arab Gulf.
If I could jump in on this, because I might differ slightly with Tuvia on this point. I think that the Gulf, quite frankly, has no concerns. On the contrary, probably relieved to see Iran cut down to size the way it has been. But I think it is important to note we are at a different time, where the Gulf is more concerned about Israel's behavior as well. And we've seen that, again, as noted in the pretty stark condemnations of Israel across the board. The one country that didn't condemn Israel, interestingly, was Syria. And I think there you do see a little more kind of overlapping interest in terms of strong antipathy toward Iran. I think the Gulf, is concerned about Israel sort of undertaking to become the military hegemon of the region. That is not, I think, from the Gulf's perspective, in their interest. And so I think you're seeing Gulf countries really sort of navigate a pretty narrow and delicate path between sort of what they view their interests to be vis-a-vis Iran and their concerns also about Israel. I would note that prior to this latest onset of conflict between Israel and Iran, we had seen a deepening, and we still continue to see, quite frankly, a deepening rapprochement between Iran and the Gulf Arab states in particular. That rapprochement does not appear to have diminished even after this 12-day war. They continue to meet and have contacts. And so I guess it's my sense that this is a slightly different situation than has pertained in the past, and it'll be interesting to watch and see where things evolve.
Thank you. I also wanted to follow up on a point that was raised earlier, which is that we currently haven't seen much external support for Iran. I think for many of us watching the types of support provided to Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, a number of analysts have argued that it's taken time, right, for other countries to provide support, including support from Iran, China, and North Korea. So So looking at the situation in the Middle East, in particular with Iran, is it possible that moving forward we might see more support from other countries? What are your thoughts on the possibility that in the next couple of weeks or months we might see more support from either China or other countries to Iran, particularly if the ceasefire holds?
So we're talking about both military support and political support, or just one or the other?
Both. And Tuve, you're probably aware of a lot of rumors of the potential for China to transfer various types of weapons to Iran, including surface-to-air missile batteries.
Yes. So first let's address that, because I think it's important. There's a lot of commentaries jumping to conclusions and building, heaps of theories about China's military support to Iran at this stage. It hasn't been verified yet. We need to wait for official verification of this piece of news, which was first the story broke on the Middle East Eye, coming from anonymous Arab officials. And we need to wait for some confirmation from intelligence agencies from Iran or China, unlikely, but still, or some visual proof before we jump to conclusions. Of course, China denied making any military support to Iran, including dual use, not just this air defense system, and it done so through the embassy in Israel. Surely the first to know about the super secret weapons transferred to Iran from China. But reality check is in order. I think Chinese arms and dual use have repeatedly appeared, not just in the region, contrary to what the embassy said in interview and statements, but also in Ukraine, in Libya, in Myanmar, and this is just in the last 12 months. And Iran, of course, with components for its missiles and drone programs appeared repeatedly from China-based or Hong Kong-based entities in the US ever-expanding list, including one statement that was made last week. And I think Mona also mentioned the chemical precursor for Iran's solid fuel missiles, as we've seen from 3 sanctioned ships making their way from China to Iranian ports, delivering sodium perchlorate. I think that the need is definitely acute, and it's there on the demand side from Iran. On the supply side, there's little that Russia could do, and I think its air defense system showed to be less on par to what was anticipated. Whereas China does have its Hongqi systems, the HQ-9, HQ-16s, which are already exported to other countries. And at a time where Russia is less reliable, they could step up. For China, it does make sense strategically to provide this support, despite all the different caveats I mentioned before. One of the most important reasons is because Iran is so weak right now, and providing it with air defense system could help offset this US and Israeli predominance. It could restore some balance to the region and some deterrence to Iran, thereby deterring future attacks, even avoiding regime change or collapse, which is definitely against China's interest. Also, it's notable that these systems are not plug and play. This is something that requires a lot of training and arming and logistical lines of supply chains. Still, we should not discount these reports. Everyone listening here, whether you're a journalist, researcher, or working in government, we need to follow this space closely, because Iran has a history of, at the very least, copying Chinese designs of weapon systems. So this is an issue. Now, back to the question, going forward, what could happen? So I think it is China's interest that diplomacy persevere. And on that front, I think its interests somewhat align with that of Israel and the US. Having bombed Iran and weakened its hand, I think now what we're looking at is an interest to reach a new nuclear deal that could also address Iran's missile program and its proxies, but first its nuclear program that hasn't disappeared, and China trying to be this responsible major power. They could have a hand in this. They did take a secondary role during the JCPOA a decade ago, and now they're showing that they are more interested in playing a role, and Iran might give this opportunity to them with Russia, and this remains to be seen. I think that a really good analysis by Zhu Zhaoyi, who is the director of the Israel program at UIB in Beijing, and he talked about China's red lines during this war. So the first red line was regime change and external military intervention, which is counter to China's interest. But still, China would not go out and help Iran militarily. This is what he wrote. He said that China's help would be limited to UN-led peacekeeping initiatives rather than condoning direct military intervention. And of course, they're against any installation of pro-Western puppet, as he called it, outside powers involved or interfering in Iran. Another red line, he said, is this military alliance, that it doesn't exist. So he agrees with all of us that there's no unconditional military defense pact between Iran and China. And finally, the nuclear issue is also a red line. So if Iranian facilities would be damaged even further, so this is against Chinese interests, but at the same time, China is definitely against Iran reaching nuclear weapon because of the implications to the region and the world, as I said before. And the last point he made, which is quite unusual, you do have some basing to it in China's security architecture for the Middle East, which it first proposed in late 18 and early 19, which included this idea that we need to create in the region a new security architecture that is post-American, post-Western. And what he said is that this new architecture should also include Iran and Israel, in addition to the Gulf states, something that hasn't been mentioned explicitly in Chinese sources before this war. And I think this could be the way going forward if we want to engage China more positively from Israel, from the US. But I think a lot will depend on the situation on the ground and what Iran would do. And anyway, I think it kind of summarizes the Chinese view going forward.
Fascinating, Tuvia. Mona, anything to add from your end in terms of what Iran might think it could get from external powers if we sort of look, a couple weeks or a couple months forward, recognizing there are limitations in what countries may be able to provide immediately?
Yeah, I think Iran will try to get whatever it can. Iran's going to try. The question is, who would be willing? And again, I just don't see it. You had asked about, for example, China, would it be willing to provide, if negotiations are going on, would it be willing to provide support? And I think, in particular on the military front, Israel has made quite clear that if Iran starts to rebuild not only its nuclear program, but also ballistic missiles, this was a comment that Prime Minister Netanyahu made during his visit to Washington last week, that Israel will feel compelled to strike again. And so I think that calculus also has to be internalized by these actors. And I don't really see it in China or anyone else's interest for this war to resume. And yet helping Iran rebuild its defense architecture, infrastructure is a sure bet that it will indeed provoke new military strikes. I don't see that as possible. I would like to just pick up on that last point that Tuvia made, which I think is fascinating in this discussion within China about a new security architecture for the region, and one that would include both Israel and Iran. And again, we're day by day here. Hard to know where things are headed. If, as the U.S. is suggesting, if there is a way to bring Iran back to the negotiating table, if Iran agrees to zero enrichment, which is pretty much what everyone determines is likely to happen if they are to resume negotiations, if there is some sort of de-escalation in the region, I do think discussions will naturally turn toward, well, this is a region, the only one in the world without a multilateral, functioning, and effective regional security architecture, no forum for dialogue to discuss differences, etc. And yet this is perhaps the most conflict-prone region of the world. So I think that those kinds of discussions will start to be had, although I had the opportunity to speak to some Gulf and other analysts over the weekend, and there I thought what was interesting is that it's not likely that we will see these sort of grand designs of a region-wide security architecture. Those discussions have been had for years and have never gone anywhere. But rather that perhaps there will be small steps taken, different nimble approaches to regional problem solving. Now, to the extent to which and how those kinds of dialogues and discussions can include both Israel and Iran, I think is an open question to say the least. But it will be interesting to watch and see if any of those kinds of ideas gain traction. But again, I think we're still a long ways off from that.
Mona, I do want to follow up on this general trend to ask you, to what extent are you actually seeing Iran's calculations change because of the war? But also in the case that you mentioned of if Israel were to engage in another strike against Iran, how would all of this potentially change Iran's calculations? And what do you actually expect in terms of Iranian activities as we move forward?
Well, that's the $64 million question, and I wouldn't purport to have the answer to it, right? And this is a very opaque regime, to say the least, the Islamic Republic. But I think if we're thinking about it analytically, we can think about two key and frankly diametrically opposed paths. One, which really had a lot of currency in the immediate aftermath of the 12-day conflict, is that Iran's lessons taken will be that it should have followed the path of North Korea and gained covertly a nuclear weapon. And so with that rationale, there was some speculation that, in fact, with whatever remaining capability Iran has, and we don't know exactly how much because, as I think Tuvia noted earlier, its cooperation with the IAEA has been suspended. There are no independent monitors on the ground anymore in Iran. So there is a fear that Iran could sprint to a crude nuclear device. That would be one path. The other, which seems to be gaining currency in more recent days, is that no, in fact, Iran, to the points that we've all been making, that Iran sort of sees the writing on the wall, is in an extraordinarily weak position, understands that its apparatus has been fairly significantly infiltrated by Israel, and that if it attempts to rebuild, it will indeed provoke strikes that it can really no longer tolerate. And there's, again, even questions about regime stability in Iran. And that with all of those factors at play, Iran, in fact, may be more willing to come to the negotiating table with the United States, even with what it had talked about as being untenable conditions such as zero enrichment. And so I think really Iran is at this sort of fork in the road, not clear which path it will take. Again, I wouldn't pretend to have any deep insight into how the multi-power centers of the regime in the Islamic Republic are working and thinking about this. But I think those are the two paths to look for, and we'll have to see and keep our eyes open for indicators as to which direction Iran is moving in.
Tuvia, could you just walk us through what you might expect from China if Iran were to walk down either of the forks of the road?
Sure. So on the one hand, you have Iran sprinting for a bomb. Under this scenario, it would be very difficult for China to maintain its open support for Iran, as it has been doing, because its explicit policy on Iran's nuclear program that it is against nuclear weapons. And of course, the policies can change, but I just don't see this happening. And in that case, you might see a situation where China joins or at least abstains in UN sanctions, but not beyond that. And again, it really depends on the situation on the ground. On the other hand, if Iran abdicates its nuclear program and here it moves towards diplomacy, then China, of course, would like to have a seat at the table and perhaps even host any future nuclear talks. I think this idea was proposed recently. I think there's also a third possibility of nuclear ambiguity. This is a policy that is also debated internally in Iran. Not entirely my specialty, but I've been following reports from INSS Iran program commentaries talking about this. And you also see there somewhat of a debate inside Iran, where on the one hand, people calling for ambiguity, saying that this could only invite more US and Israeli attacks. And on the other hand, people saying that this would prevent North Koreanization of Iran. And Iran is not North Korea. Iranian people are not North Korean. They are part of this Eurasian landmass. It's a very different situation, and it could become untenable this way or another, and this is why a more cautious position. And I think, if you ask me, this a more likely situation where we don't know where this 400 kilograms of enriched uranium is placed at the moment. We don't know what are their plans on sprinting to a bomb. And because of this ambiguity, it leaves a lot of the other actors reactive and unable to take conclusive steps without more tangible, concrete evidence to Iran's preferred policy position.
A lot of food for thought. And as both of you mentioned, it's a very uncertain situation where we really need a lot more information, a lot more intelligence. And of course, there's also a lot of rumors that are not true, right? So it's a very difficult situation to unpack, and I really appreciate the two of you joining me to the extent possible, describing the situation in the region as well as where China fits in.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie.